What if the person smiling in front of everyone is hiding something no one can see? Something heavy, something dark, something that slowly changes everything. This is the story of three teenage girls whose lives looked normal on the outside, but felt completely different on the inside. And the deeper you go, the more disturbing it becomes. The first story begins with a girl named Lila, and at first, nothing about her seemed unusual. She laughed with her friends, did well in school, and posted happy pictures online. But sometimes the happiest faces hide the quietest pain, and that's where her story really starts. Every night, when the lights went off and the world got quiet, Lila would sit alone in her room, staring at her phone, waiting for messages that never came, and slowly, that silence began to feel louder than any noise, and that's when things started to change. She began to compare herself to others, scrolling endlessly, seeing perfect lives, perfect faces, perfect moments, and, with every swipe, she felt smaller, less important, less seen. And the worst part was, no one noticed. Not her friends, not her family, not even the people she spent every day with, and that's how it got deeper. She started pulling away, replying less, smiling less, talking less, and people assumed she was just tired, but the truth was far more complicated. Inside her mind, thoughts began to repeat, telling her she wasn't enough, telling her she didn't matter, and over time, those thoughts got louder, stronger, harder to ignore. And that's when the darkness truly settled in. One night, she received a message, just one, from someone she didn't know. And at first, it felt harmless, just a simple, hey. But sometimes, the smallest moments lead to the biggest changes, she replied. And the conversation started. And for the first time in a long time, she felt noticed, understood, seen. And that feeling pulled her in deeper, day by day, message by message. She began to trust this person, sharing things she had never told anyone else. And that's where the danger began. Because not everyone online is who they seem. And slowly, the tone changed. The messages became more intense, more controlling, asking questions that felt too personal, too invasive. But by then, she was already attached, already dependent on the attention. And that's when things took a turn. The person began to pressure her, asking for things she wasn't comfortable with, threatening to leave if she didn't comply. And in her mind, losing that connection felt worse than anything else. So she gave in, little by little, until she realized she had gone too far. And that's when the fear set in. Real fear, because the person didn't stop. They demanded more. They threatened to expose everything she had shared, and suddenly, she felt trapped. Completely trapped. And the worst part was, she felt like she had no one to turn to. Because, how do you explain something like that? How do you admit you trusted the wrong person, and that's when her world became smaller, darker, heavier. Until one day, she finally told someone, and that moment changed everything, because sometimes, the hardest thing to do is also the most important. And her story reminds us that silence can be dangerous, but speaking up can save you. The second story is about a girl named Maya, and her life was different from the start. She didn't have many friends. She preferred being alone, drawing, writing, staying in her own world. And at first, it seemed like a choice. But over time, it became something else, something deeper, because loneliness doesn't always show itself clearly. Sometimes it hides behind quiet habits, quiet routines. And that's where Maya's story begins. Every day after school, she would go straight to her room, close the door, and disappear into her thoughts. And at first, it felt safe, comfortable, like a place she could control. But slowly, that space began to change. It didn't feel safe anymore. It felt heavy, like something was watching, something she couldn't explain. And that's when the fear started. Small at first, just a feeling, just a thought. But then it grew. She began to hear things, soft noises at night, faint whispers that didn't make sense. And at first, she ignored it, telling herself it was just her imagination. But it didn't stop. It got louder, clearer, more real. And that's when she started losing sleep, staying awake for hours, afraid to close her eyes, afraid of what she might hear next. And the lack of sleep began to affect everything. Her schoolwork, her mood, her energy. And people started noticing. But they didn't understand. They thought she was just tired, just distracted. But the truth was far more disturbing. Because inside her mind, the line between real and unreal was starting to blur. And that's when things took a darker turn. One night, she heard her name, clearly whispered from the corner of her room. She froze, her heart racing, too afraid to move, too afraid to look. And when she finally did, there was nothing there, just shadows, just darkness. But the voice felt real, too real to ignore. And from that night on, it didn't stop. It followed her, not just at home, but at school. In quiet moments, in empty spaces, always just out of reach. And that's when the fear became constant. Not just something she experienced at night, but something that stayed with her all the time. And slowly, she began to question everything. What was real? What wasn't? What she could trust, and what she couldn't. And that confusion became overwhelming, until one day, she broke down, unable to hold it in any longer. And when she finally told someone, everything started to make sense, because sometimes what feels like something external is actually something internal, something that needs understanding, support, and care. And her story reminds us that not all darkness comes from outside. Sometimes it comes from within. And recognizing it is the first step to overcoming it. The third story is about a girl named Zara, and her life seemed exciting, full of energy, always surrounded by people, always busy, always doing something. But sometimes, being surrounded by people doesn't mean you feel connected. And that's where her story begins. She was always online, always posting, always sharing, building a life that looked perfect from the outside. But behind the screen, things were different. She felt pressure, constant pressure to keep up, to look good, to stay relevant. And that pressure slowly built up, turning into stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. But she didn't stop, because stopping felt like failing, and failing felt like losing everything she had built. And that's when things started to slip. She began taking bigger risks, posting more personal content, sharing more of her life, pushing boundaries she never thought she would cross. All for attention, all for validation. And at first, it worked. More likes, more comments, more followers. But it also attracted the wrong kind of attention. Messages from strangers, comments that felt too personal, too invasive. And that's when the situation changed. One person started messaging her constantly. At first, it seemed harmless, just another follower. But then it became something else, something darker. They knew details about her life that she hadn't shared publicly, things that felt private, things that made her uncomfortable. And that's when the fear began. Real fear, because it wasn't just online anymore. It felt close, too close. She tried to ignore it, block it, move on. But it didn't stop. New accounts, new messages, always the same tone, always watching, always present. And that's when she realized something terrifying. She had shared too much, and now she couldn't take it back. And that feeling of being watched followed her everywhere, at home, at school, even when she was with friends. And that's when her world started shrinking, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, until she felt trapped in her own life. And that's when she made a choice. She stepped back, deleted posts, changed habits, and most importantly, asked for help. And that decision changed everything. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop, step back, and protect yourself. And her story reminds us that not everything online is safe. Not everything is worth sharing. And sometimes, the line between connection and danger is thinner than we think. These three stories may be different, but they share one truth. The teenage years can be complicated, confusing, and sometimes overwhelming. And the challenges faced during this time are not always visible, not always understood. But they are real, and they matter. And the most important thing to remember is that no one has to face them alone. Because behind every story, no matter how dark, there is always a way forward, always a chance to change, and always someone willing to listen. If you're brave enough to speak, and if there's one thing these stories teach us, it's this. What you see on the outside is not always the full picture. And sometimes, the most important stories are the ones no one is talking about.